Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's N3AS seminar. Today, we will have Jackson Olsen from University of Minnesota to tell us about comparing supernova models using neutrino data. He's a PhD student and is going to graduate soon, and we will be happy to hear him talking about this exciting work. So Jackson, please take it away.
Thanks. Thanks for the introduction and also for the opportunity to talk today. So in recent years, core collapse supernova simulations have grown sophisticated enough to cover the neutrino signal in detail for about 10 seconds. And 10 seconds is also the time scale that we'd expect to observe the signal in a terrestrial detector on Earth from, for instance, a galactic core collapse supernova. So this, I think, leads to a natural question, which is it feasible to distinguish between these different simulation models using either the data from supernova 1987A or data from some future galactic supernova? And so this is the question that I'll be addressing today, and it also naturally splits my talk into two parts. The first addressing what we can do with the 1987A data, and then the second part with data from some future supernova. So I'll consider three models today. These were generously provided by the Garshing group, and they vary in both the model's progenitor structure and also the high density nuclear equation of state. And just to break down sort of the coding for how we've labeled these models, the numbers here, the 9.6, 20, 27, they correspond to the mass of the progenitor star. So 9.6 is a 9.6 solar mass star, 20 solar mass, and so on. And then the second piece is the equation of state. So we consider the SFHO equation of state and LS220. Now, neutrino emission tends to follow three main phases. Initially, right after core bounce, there's a burst of electron neutrinos. That's this black curve here with a time scale of about 10 milliseconds. This is followed by an accretion emission period. Here, matter is following on to the dense inner core of the star called the protoneutron star, leading to emission of electron neutrinos and also electron antineutrinos, these black and blue curves. And this period in particular is sensitive to neutrino oscillations because you can see there's a sharp difference between the nu E bar, or nu E bar, and nu X, where nu X is designates any of the other four neutrino species. And this phase tends to be model dependent, unlike the electron neutrino burst. This initial burst tends to be model independent. The accretion phase tends to be model dependent, and in particular, it depends on the progenitor structure for the model. So this basically the density profile in the interior of the star has a big effect on this phase. And so this phase lasts on the order of hundreds of milliseconds and is followed by a longer cooling phase in which the protoneutron star cools via neutrino emission. And this phase lasts on the order of 10 seconds and is characterized by emission of all 6 neutrino species roughly equally. And because this depends in large part on the diffusion properties of the protoneutron star, it's also model dependent, but it depends on the equation of state. So we have 3 phases. This first phase, pretty model independent. Second phase depends mainly on the progenitor structure, and third phase depends mainly on the equation of state. Now here, I've plotted the neutrino signals for the 3 models that I'll be considering today. In particular, I've plotted the nu E bar and nu X bar signals because it turns out those will be the most relevant. And you can see in this top row, which is the neutrino luminosity, that the lower mass 9.6 solar mass star has a not very pronounced accretion period. This is really just, there's not much happening. Whereas with the 20 and the 27 solar mass stars, there's a much more pronounced accretion period, in particular with the 20 solar mass star. Then the middle panel shows the average neutrino energy, and the bottom panel shows this alpha parameter, which is used to parameterize the neutrino spectrum. It depends on the first two moments of the energy, and I have it defined over here. So now that I've sort of gone through the models that we'll be looking at today a little bit, let's talk about the data that we have. We have neutrino data from exactly one supernova, supernova 1987A. This data was observed in 3 detectors: the Kamiokande 2 detector, which saw 11 events, IMB, which saw 8, and Boxon, which saw 5. Now, for my talk today, I'll be focusing in particular on the Kamiokande 2 data. IMBs had some issues with photomultiplier tube coverage, and Boxon was a smaller detector. So really, I'll just be focusing on this Kamiokande data. So Kamiokande was a 2 kiloton water Cherenkov detector. Because it's a water Cherenkov detector, the best channel for supernova neutrino detection is this inverse beta decay channel, in which an electron antineutrino interacts with a proton, produces a positron and a neutron, and the Cherenkov radiation from the emitted positron is what's actually observed in the detector. Now, this interaction only occurs for electron antineutrinos. So that means that the only relevant species are nu E bar and also nu X bar, because of oscillations they can get mixed together. We're also going to assume that all 11 events occurred via inverse beta decay. This is a pretty good assumption because inverse beta decay has a cross section about an order of magnitude larger than the next best channel. And this is typically, I think, what's done in the literature, is assuming that these occurred via inverse beta decay. Now, because we're only sensitive to the antineutrinos, that means that we're not sensitive to this initial electron neutrino burst with this data. We're only sensitive to the accretion period and the PNS cooling. But that's okay for us because we want to compare different models. And we already said that the initial electron neutrino burst is relatively model independent. So we're only sensitive to the model dependent stuff, which works out nicely. Now, I've just here put down the predicted flux at the detector, how you calculate that from the model predictions. Depends obviously on the luminosity, the average energy, the neutrino spectrum, and then also this distance to the supernova. And then this is actually the predicted event rate. The F det here is the flux of neutrinos inside the detector from the supernova. And then all of this stuff on the right is basically detector characteristics, taking into account the efficiency, energy resolution, et cetera. And then we also add this energy dependent background rate because Kamiokande had a non-negligible background. So we need to include that as well. Now, I'm also going to incorporate oscillations into this analysis. I'm just going to consider 3, really simple oscillation scenarios. I know that people are working on some, really exciting possibilities, but I just want to, give us sort of a quick flavor of what sorts of oscillation effects we might and might not be sensitive to. So I'm just going to stick with these 3 very, simple cases in which, first, no oscillations occur, and then the standard MSW effects with the normal and inverted hierarchies. And you can see, even with just these 3, very simple scenarios, we get a good spread in the possible swapping between new E bar and new X bar. Obviously, when there's no oscillations, there's no swapping. But then with the inverted hierarchy, we get almost complete swapping. And so we do get a nice spread here. Now, I also have to introduce a couple of model parameters. The first is sort of just an experimental reality, which is that we need to sync up the neutrino signal, like the predicted model time, with the first detected event. So there's, and what I mean by this is that there's no way to determine when exactly the neutrino signal reaches the detector relative to this first event. We have to pick on our model curve where the first event happens, and there's no way to measure that. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna introduce a parameter that I'm calling the time offset, and we'll fit this the way we would any model parameter. And this will account for that difficulty. And I'm also going to introduce as a second parameter the supernova distance. Now, the distance to 1987A has been measured pretty well to 51.4 plus or minus 1.2 kiloparsecs. But I just want to allow this to vary just a little bit to see if that has any effect. So I'll treat this as a parameter, but I'm going to restrict this in a certain way that I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. Now, I've talked about the data now and the models that we want to compare. And so now it's time for me to talk about the machinery that we're going to use to actually do that. And to do that, I'm going to use Bayesian statistics. Now, there's a fairly straightforward way to perform a model comparison analysis using Bayesian statistics. The goal is to calculate the probability for the models given some data. So what you do is you start with any prior information you have with the models. You multiply this by some factor that's called the Bayesian evidence, basically the evidence in favor, like the evidence in favor of the model provided by the data. Then you normalize it, and this gives you your new model probabilities. So in a little bit more detail, we have no reason to favor any one model over another. So we'll set this model prior to be uniform. Now, the Bayesian evidence, in our case, it takes the form of an integral over the model parameters. That's this vector theta here, an integral of the likelihood function for the model parameters multiplied by any prior information we have about those parameters. So no prior information about the time offset, so we'll set that to be uniform too. But like I said, we do have a good measurement already of the supernova distance. So we'll make our distance prior a Gaussian function, basically following this measurement. And then the denominator is the normalization constant, which works exactly how you'd expect it to. Now, with that machinery, we get probabilities for the models given the data, but we still need to learn how to interpret this. And really the Bayesian community has sort of done the work for us here. They've developed this factor called the Bayes factor between two models, call them M alpha and M beta. And in our case, it's really just the ratio of the model probabilities. And so the way you interpret these ratios is if it's between 1 and 3, there's really no evidence in favor of one model over the other. Between 3 and 20, some evidence, 20 to 150, strong evidence, and then greater than 150, or if the natural log is greater than 5, you have very strong evidence. So the numbers I want you to remember are 3 is the threshold between no and some evidence, 20 is the threshold between some and strong evidence, and this 5 factor for the logarithm is very, very strong evidence. So here are the results that I find with the 1987A data. We see immediately that the 9.6 solar mass model is most favored. And here I've also included each of the 3 oscillation scenarios. So we can see, comparing the 9.6 solar mass model with the 20 solar mass model, we find a Bayes factor of, between 40 and 50, which is above this 20 threshold, so it's strongly favored. The evidence isn't quite as good in favor of 9.6 over 27. There we get something just over 3. So there's some evidence in favor of 9.6, but not a lot of evidence. And then finally, if we take one model and compare between oscillation scenarios, we see that there's really no preference among the different oscillation scenarios. So with this 1987A data, we can draw some limited conclusions about the model favorability. In particular, the data seems to favor a model with a shorter accretion period, this Z9.6 model. But we can't really draw any insights about the neutrino oscillations. But still, I just want to take a moment and think about the fact that just with 11 events, we could draw some limited conclusions, which is a little bit incredible. So we talked about the past data, but I think this naturally leads to another question, which is, well, we expect something on the order of 1 to 3 galactic supernovas per century, and we have better detectors running now than we did in 1987. So we should see many more neutrinos from the next galactic supernova. And well, would that be enough to be able to distinguish between these models, this data from this next supernova? So to answer this question, let's consider a relatively simple example. Let's imagine that we have some ideal water Cherenkov detector. We'll say, no background, perfect efficiency, energy resolution. We'll give it the mass of Super Kamiokande, just to, pick a reasonable number. And again, we'll still focus just on this inverse beta decay channel. And now let's say that a supernova occurs at 50 kiloparsecs, and we'll assume that this distance is measured very well. So a supernova occurs at 50 kiloparsecs. It follows the emission predictions of the 9.6 solar mass model, and we'll just assume that there are no oscillations. That's kind of unrealistic, but simple example. And so let's do the obvious thing to determine whether we could distinguish this model from the other two in this situation, which is, let's just simulate a bunch of possible data sets of this scenario, and then compute the Bayes factors between the 9.6 solar mass model and the other two, just to see what we get. And actually, at this point, I'm going to switch from the Bayes factor to the log of the Bayes factor. This is just for computational simplicity. So the threshold value to be thinking of now is the log Bayes factor greater than 5. So that's the threshold for very strong evidence. And so when you run a bunch of simulations and you do this, you find a distribution of the log Bayes factors, for instance, between Z9.6 and S27, that's peaked around 65 or 70, which is obviously far to the right of our threshold value of 5. So we could say, pretty confidently, at least in this situation, that yes, we could tell the two models apart. Now, so here I've got those S27 results that I showed just a second ago, and then also the comparison with the S20 model, and we see that this is even better. So in this situation, yeah, we could tell the two models apart. I also want to take a second to just make a note about the parameter choices that I made here. This middle column, for those results, I assumed that we wouldn't know the time offset, so we have to do the elaborate integration procedure to take into account the unknown time offset. In this column on the right, I just assumed that we'd know the time offset. This is obviously unphysical, unrealistic, but we see that it doesn't actually make much difference. The difference is on the order of less than 1%. So for the sake of my computational time going forward, I'm just gonna assume that we're gonna know the time offset. Again, unrealistic. In the event of an actual supernova detection, we would do the big fitting procedure, but just as an approximation, we'll assume it's known. So you might be saying, okay, well, that's great and everything, but that was an ideal detector. What about a realistic detector? So let's base our detector model now on the Super Kamiokande detector. This is a 32 kiloton water Cherenkov detector running right now. So, you know, it could be running when the next galactic supernova happens. This is much more realistic. So the background is negligible. We'll take a very conservative detector efficiency, just, you know, grab the energy resolution from one of their papers. And then we can still just focus on the inverse beta decay events because the experiment has recently begun introducing gadolinium into the detector, which allows for the tagging of these IBD events. So we can still just focus on those. So with the Super K detector and supernova at 50 kiloparsecs following one of these three models, these are the results that I find. Let me take a moment to walk you through them. So this left column, this corresponds to the true model. So the top row corresponds to when the 9.6 solar mass model is true, then the middle row is S20, and so on. And inside each cell, the top row corresponds to the result when there are no oscillations, normal hierarchy, and inverted hierarchy. So we see that the results do depend a lot, or at least quite a bit, on the oscillation scenario. But still, at 50 kiloparsecs with the Super K detector, all of these various scenarios, all of these different pairs can be distinguished. They're all at least 2 standard deviations away from this threshold value of 5, and they can be distinguished regardless of the oscillation scenario. So to conclude, we found that by applying these Bayesian model comparison techniques, the Supernova 1987A neutrino data, at least in the Kamiokande 2 detector, seems to favor a model with a short accretion period. We could also use these techniques in the event of a future galactic supernova to distinguish between neutrino emission models. And the 3 models that we considered here could be distinguished up to 50 kiloparsecs. Now, you could do this analysis, obviously, for any model for which you have predictions. I've done it for a few others, some of which are more similar than the 3 I considered here. And in that case, this distance gets lowered a bit, but they're still all distinguishable up to at least 25 kiloparsecs, which is pretty good. And then here is some of my funding information, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Jackson, for this interesting talk. Now is the time for question. I see George has a comment. Maybe you like to ask, or
okay, I'll take my turn in the questions.
Good, please.
Go ahead, let somebody else ask a question.
I see, Susan, you want to ask? Please unmute yourself.
Oh yeah, so I did a very simple question regarding slide 22. You had previously pitched the T-off as an important parameter, but yet when you studied its effect explicitly, you saw there was very little difference. Do you have a particular idea why it turned out to be that way?
Yeah, so I think it would matter more if I did this study for the 1987 A scenario, I think it would matter more just because there are fewer events there. In the case of the situation that I'm considering here, you're seeing, I don't know, hundreds or thousands, probably hundreds at 50 kiloparsecs of neutrinos. And so that just reduces the importance of the time offset because you're more likely to have the signal start at 0. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess what you're saying is that the current technology of the new detectors are such that you would detect so very many events that the impact of T-off is much mitigated.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Basically, the more events you see, I think the less it matters.
Thank you.
Time for George.
Okay, thank you, Jackson. That was a great talk.
Thanks.
So a couple issues. One is that, you know, I understand why you isolated the neutronization burst, and you can't really say anything about that. You know, it is interesting though that it's the one place where you expect mostly neutrinos and not antineutrinos, so that you know, physics that changes neutrinos to antineutrinos, usually neutrino mass dependent in some way, and not very likely, but nevertheless it's interesting. I mean, I wonder if you thought about that at all. So that's the first question.
Okay. I haven't thought about it at all. So.
Okay, fair enough. And it may not even be worth thinking about, but nevertheless, it is an interesting regime, right? If you see if you see a significant number of antineutrinos in the neutronization burst, then that's kind of a marker for some interesting physics.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for pointing that out.
The second point, yeah, is really in looking at the water Cherenkov detectors. Did you think at all about the charge current capture of NU-E's on oxygen-16?
So I didn't. Certainly that would be something interesting.
Threshold for that. I mean, Wick wrote a nice paper about that. So there's a high threshold, energy threshold for it. It's something like 38 or 39 MeV. Nevertheless, in some of these oscillation scenarios, you might get something like that. So.
Yeah, I think it's certainly a good next step to go somewhere in that direction. I was more focused here on, you know, if we just look at this one channel, oh, it's pretty incredible that, like, yeah, we can definitely tell these models apart.
Very good. Yeah, I agree. Anyway, thank you very much. Very nice talk.
Sure, thank you.
We have Pedro next.
Hi, thanks for the nice talk. So I'm curious about how far away a signal would be or would have to be until you can no longer, I guess, differentiate between models. Is it on the order of megaparsecs, hundreds of megaparsecs? Or?
So this is obviously going to depend a lot on the two models that you're trying to compare, right? Because if the models are, you know, infinitely similar, you'd have to be infinitely close to the supernova to distinguish them. But for these models, I would say it's probably on the order of like 100 kiloparsecs, somewhere around there. But again, it's going to depend a lot on the models.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Sanjay is the next.
Hi, Jackson. Thanks for a nice talk. Unfortunately, I missed the first 2 or 3 minutes of your talk. So this is just a clarification question. Did you focus your attention only on the very early time neutrino emission or the entire neutrino signal?
So the first part of the talk, the 1987A, I considered the like full 12.5 seconds of the signal. For the second part, I looked at I think up to 9 seconds. And so basically the whole signal.
Okay, so several years ago, I think there was a similar analysis done for 87A by Laredo and Lamb, I believe. And
yeah.
They had much simpler parameterizations of the neutrino light curve in terms of, say, a temperature and a time scale for cooling. Have you done similar analysis? And how does your analysis compare with that earlier work?
Yeah, so I used a lot of the same techniques that they did, and they did a very thorough job considering the parameterized models. So here, what I was trying to look at were these more I don't want to say realistic, but I guess realistic models based on simulation. So actually, there is a little bit of tension between my results and their results, and that here in my analysis, I found that the data favors, a model with a shorter accretion period, and I think their results favored a stronger accretion emission. But it's hard to do a one-to-one comparison because we were comparing different models.
Okay, so can I ask another follow-up question?
Mm-hmm.
The evolution of the temperature or the spectrum of neutrinos that is predicted by these different models, are they distinctly different, or are they very similar to each other?
So I guess you can look at the alpha parameter here. This is controlling the spectral shape. And so you see that the 9.6 solar mass model is fairly different, at least in this first second, than the other two models, which have, very similar shapes. But I don't know, the tail here in the PNS cooling phase, at least the 9.6 and the S20 models have very similar shapes, it looks to me. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Sure.
I see there is a question by Sherwood in the chat. Sherwood, would you like to ask yourself?
Sorry, it's a little bit complicated. So thinking about Bayesian analysis for binary black hole gravitational waves, it's like a 7-dimensional, if you're trying to do parameter estimation, it's like a 7-dimensional thing with the masses of each object and the spins of each object and all that. And so you determine what's the most likely model by which one has the biggest Bayes factor for all those.
Right.
In the context, so we think that we understand general relativity well enough for that to happen, but in the context of lots of unknowns that could change the signal, like what George was talking about, and also just the equation of state and neutrino properties, how do we interpret the results in terms of unknowns like these that aren't present in binary black hole parameter estimation?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And if I'm understanding you correctly, I think a lot of that would come in at the model simulation phase, right? And so really, I just for this analysis that I've done, I just have to trust these three models, and there's no way to really, open the black box and go in and look at the uncertainties in the models themselves. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, it makes me, so it just seems to me like we can say, oh, this model, when we see another supernova in the future, we can say, oh, this model is the most likely. But I would be, I don't know how to say how confident we are that it actually was a 13 solar mass red supergiant progenitor based on this kind of analysis if we don't have a handle on the unknowns.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question, and I'm not really sure I have an answer for you, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, it's just something that I worry about for these kinds of analysis, and I think it's still very interesting and valuable to do this kind of thing. It's just it's such a complicated problem.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like I think sort of the question that you're asking is, it's great that we have these 3 models, and we could, of course, do this analysis with like 100 other models or 1,000 other models, but how do we know that any of those models are right? And in the Bayesian sense, you have to assume that at least one of the models is right.
Yeah. Yeah, so maybe it would be interesting in the future to sort of like try to establish which properties actually have an influence on this kind of analysis. Like you might say that the one mixing angle doesn't really matter or something like that. So then you have like the basic set of things that you do expect to influence the final result. And then I don't know, just
yeah, I see what you're saying, and I think that would be interesting, but you'd need a lot of models to yeah.
All right, yeah. Thanks for entertaining the question.
Thanks.
So can I just make a comment about this discussion? In general, when you have a model space that's well defined, so right now you have 3-letter acronyms or 4-letter acronyms for a bunch of equation of state models, and some scheme that is being used for neutrino transport, and some scheme that is being used for, say, hydrodynamics. As long as the parameter space is not too large, and it's like, say, even if it's 10-dimensional, there is a way to marginalize over the parameter space if you can run a large suite of simulations, right? Ultimately, my feeling is that this is the problem we're going to encounter with understanding supernova neutrino data, is that you're going to first have to figure out what is the parameter space, and then do the best theory. For example, on the nuclear equation of state, one will have to figure out, are these equations of state really distinct, or are they part of the same family with a parameter that varies over some range? And if you can do that, then I think you can address Sherwood's question. And then you could go back and say, if I want to know whether or not accretion occurs and for what duration it occurs, then you marginalize over all of the other parameters, and then figure out whether or not you have evidence for it. And I think in cosmology, for example, they do similar things. They devise large scale simulations, and they figure out what is the suite of simulations to run to be able to marginalize over these parameters. And that's maybe eventually supernova neutrino science will be getting to that point.
Yeah. Thanks for that comment. I think that's a good point and a good direction to be looking.
Maybe I can ask a simple question. So you have these results showing preference for SFHO over LS220 has been the first slide of your Bayesian results. And then in the conclusion, you mentioned this shorter accretion period.
Yeah.
Maybe can you say a bit more, like what are the most important differences between these two EOS that lead to different accretion periods? Like what properties of EOS is the most important one?
Yeah. So the main effect that the equation of state is going to have is going to be, I think, in the contraction of the protoneutron star. And so, for instance, like during the cooling phase, the LS220 equation of state contracts more quickly than the SFHO. And so that leads like, let me see if it's visible in my figures here. This is sort of hard to see, but if I had plotted these on top of each other, you might be able to see that the LS220 has like a higher initial luminosity, and then it drops more quickly than the SFHO. So I think that's the main impact that the equation of state is going to have, at least in terms of the luminosities. I don't know, like I've looked at, for instance, like Z9.6 LS220 as well as SFHO. And there, as far as I can tell, there aren't major differences. Well, now I'm relying on memory, but I don't think there are too many major differences between the two during the accretion period. Maybe a little bit in the energy and the spectrum. I would have to go back and check. But really, it's I think the progenitor structure that's having the biggest impact during the accretion period. I'm not sure if I answered your question or not, but
yeah, thanks. I think I was asking a follow-up question to Shower's question.
Okay.
Before that, we need to somehow disentangle effects from progenitor structure and equation state.
Yeah.
But I am asking the next step, like how possibly can you even distinguish the most important contribution from the US itself is going to be more complicated, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's, I think it'll be more complicated. I've looked at it just a little bit, but I don't have any succinct insights for you.
Sure, no problem.
Sorry.
And I don't see more questions from the audience. Any comments? No? So let's thank Jackson again. And if you have time, we have informal discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you.
John Jackson.
Thank you, Jackson.